What is up everyone, and welcome back to another video. So as you probably know by now, losing points in arena is a very common issue that players run into in Fortnite, especially nowadays when everyone seems to be so good at the game. Even in lower divisions, it makes sense that a lot of you guys may be struggling to consistently gain points. And since this issue is so common, in today's video I'll be going over a bunch of ways to stop losing points in arena during chapter 3 season 4 and future seasons. Before we get into it though, if you find this video helpful, then be sure to drop a like on it and consider subscribing as well if you're new and want to see more content just like this in the future. And lastly, if you want to show some extra support, then consider using code TECHO in the item shop, as it's 100% free and it seriously helps me out a bunch. But with all that said and without further ado, let's get into today's video. So the first tip I have for you guys is one that is super simple yet something that so many players fail to do, and that's to land less aggressive. In arena, a huge portion of the lobby is going to be going to the popular locations like Tilted Towers, Coney Crossroads, Rocky Reels, and places like those. And if you can handle the heat and survive in those locations, then that's totally fine. But if you find yourself dying off spawn constantly, or you can't seem to get good loot, materials, and HP before mid-game, then chances are you could go for a less aggressive drop to get some more time to loot and farm up, and not only end up with a much better situation going into mid-game, but also end up alive, which the majority of players who landed those aggressive spots are not able to do. After all, if 20 people land tilted, for example, and one person survives, that means each person had a 5% chance of surviving, which isn't exactly good. As I'll be discussing in this video, placement points are king this season, and if you secure a couple of kills and then you die off spawn, that's cool and all, but you're still going to be losing points with that strategy once you reach higher divisions with higher bus fare. Obviously, if you're in open league, then it doesn't really matter if you die off spawn, but once you get higher up, it really does get difficult. So overall, if you find yourself dying off spawn a bunch, then consider dropping in a more quiet location, taking a little bit of extra time to get sorted, and hold off on fighting until you're in a good position to do so. So the second tip I have for this video is one that kind of pains me to say simply because I love W King in arena, but this tip is to focus on placement if your main priority is gaining points, especially once you start reaching higher divisions. The point system this season, at least once you hit contenders and champs, quickly turns from favorable towards eliminations to favorable towards placement. For example, in Champions League, for every game mode you get 5 points per kill. Keep in mind this is only champs, not opener contenders. But for getting one win even with 0 eliminations, you get 175 points. So in Champions League, you have to get 35 kills in one game to even match the amount of placement points you can get from simply winning the game. And that's just an absurd ratio. And even though that's only for champs, the same kind of deal does apply with Contenders League to a lesser extent. It is a bit less severe in Contenders, but it definitely is still a more placement focused structure. And in Open League, there's no bus fare, so you can literally just do whatever you want. But with that said, I do want to add that focusing on placement in order to gain points is not equivalent at all to camping. Obviously, if you so choose, you can feel free to land at an obscure edge map location, sit in bushes all game, and just pray you can kill the last player, and there's a fair chance that you can get to champs even from that alone if you do it enough times. But if you're trying to actually improve at the game while also gaining arena points, what I'd opt for instead is more of like a hybrid playstyle where you're not overly passive, but you only take intelligent fights. For example, I think you should be willing to fight a player or two in order to secure a good loot spot, and you should have no problem racking up a few kills in mid-game through fights and in endgame through getting picks, and of course from the last few players as well. Getting anywhere from like 5 to 10 kills for a win is a pretty good sweet spot for arena. Of course, that's assuming that your goal is to play a moderate playstyle rather than super passive or super aggressive. The main idea here is not to be wildly aggressive to the point where you're losing in early and mid-game most of the time, but rather to play a bit more cautious, take some extra time to loot and farm up, and really just emphasize more placement-based strategies so you can consistently get those placement points and top it up with whatever eliminations you can gather as well. If you find yourself losing a lot of games because you're being too aggressive, then that should seriously help you get out of your point drought. Moving on to my third tip for this video though, and the next tip I have for you all is to VOD review your matches. I can't tell you guys how often someone complains about how they're losing in arena, yet they have absolutely no idea why. The truth is that in Fortnite, we all have weaknesses, and a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. Chances are there are a couple of areas of your gameplay that are holding you back, which you may not even know about. Maybe you're taking 50-50s, maybe a certain area of your mechanics aren't up to par, or maybe you're lacking awareness, or dozens of other factors. But the only consistent way to actually find out where your weaknesses are and find a way to improve on them is to VOD review. If you're not familiar with it yet, VOD reviewing is essentially just the act of watching back your old games from a reflective point of view and just seeing what you do right and wrong and how you handle various situations. The reason this works so well is because frankly there's a lot of stuff that you're not going to pick up on from simply playing the game. A lot of different things in your gameplay are going to be hidden right below your nose, constantly happening, but you have no idea. Taking the time to watch back your gameplay, learn from your mistakes, and capitalize on your strength is definitely one of the most effective ways to improve at the game and figure out what the actual issues are that are holding you back from gaining arena points. And once you actually manage to find those issues through VOD reviews, you can then develop an actual strategy to target them and fix them. So overall, if you're losing arena points, VOD reviewing is definitely one of the most effective ways to fix that. Moving on from that, the next tip for today's video is one that's specifically tailored to team modes. Since I do find that trios is the best game mode to gain arena points based on the current point system, closely followed by duos, and then solos is the worst. And this tip is to find consistent teammates to play with. So many players are stuck in the constant cycle of getting on Fortnite, not having good players to play with, looking for randoms, playing with them, leaving, never playing with them again, and then rinse and repeat. And this would work fine, but the problem is that you never know how randoms are going to end up, and a lot of players end up losing points in team modes because they don't click with the randoms they play with. For example, if you play with someone and you die off spawn 3 times in a row, then boom, you lose, like whatever. And that's why I recommend if you're using team modes to gain arena points, then you definitely should find consistent teammates. This doesn't have to be a permanent team or even a competitive team, but really just finding a circle of people that you can play with. That way, whenever you need to find teammates, you don't have to look for random people in scrim discords. So if you do find yourself struggling to find teammates that you click with and you always find yourself playing with different randoms, next time you find yourself a good player that you vibe with, definitely keep playing with one another in the future and avoid the hassle of having to constantly find new teammates and hope they're good. Also guys, if you need a place to find teammates, then feel free to check out my Discord server, which is going to be linked in the description. All you need to do in the server is select your Fortnite region, and then you're going to gain access to a bunch of looking for group chats where you can find teammates for arena, tournaments, creative, or whatever else you might need. Once again, if you want to check that out, the link is going to be in the description. My next tip for this video is a pretty simple one, but it is surprisingly overlooked, and that's just simply play more arena. The fact of the matter is that specificity is very powerful for improving at this game. If you're trying to get super good at arena, then putting in the hours to actually play arena, learn the ins and outs of the meta, and just become a better overall player through direct practice is what you need to do. I absolutely love doing things like creative practice to improve, which I'll actually be discussing in our next tip, but you really just can't overlook the power of improving at something simply by doing it over and over again. There's a reason why if you look at any crazy arena player stats, they have many hundreds or even maybe thousands of games played in recent seasons. That's because one of the most effective ways to improve at something is to do it repeatedly, run into all the possible situations you can run into, and master it that way. So if you find yourself struggling to gain points, definitely consider the simple idea of whether or not you're actually playing enough arena to improve at it, and you may be surprised by how much you can improve simply by getting a higher number of games in. Moving on to our last tip for this video though, and this one is to grind fighting practice in creative. In arena, being insane at fighting is pretty much the ultimate skill. Certain areas of strategy do come into play at some points, but the fact is that if you're an insane fighter, even if your game sense isn't too spectacular, you're still going to perform super well. What I recommend you guys do as a supplement to your arena practice is grind out various forms of fighting practice as well. Some of these might include build fights, box fights, zone wars, realistic 1v1s, and all sorts of things like those. The main reason I recommend these is because they're so much more efficient in terms of the actual amount of fights you run into. For example, in an hour of doing 1v1s, you can probably run into 70 to 100 fights, whereas you'd be lucky to run into like 25 or 30 legitimate fights in an hour of playing arena. So as a supplement to your arena practice and to work on some of the intricacies of your fighting skill, doing these forms of fighting practice is definitely helpful. As well as that, something to note when you're doing this fighting practice is to really try and find good players to do it with. I find that the standards you set for your creative practice almost always reflect the skill level that you reach in game. If you're only playing against friends you can destroy in 1v1s all day, then you're really not learning anything and you probably are not improving much. On the other hand, if you're playing against super skilled players, you're constantly forced to adapt, think on your feet, and pull off certain moves which all help you improve at fighting dramatically. As a regular player, you can probably find good enough players simply by hopping into matchmaking in a 1v1 map, for example, but you also have the option to find players in scrim servers if you need people who are a bit more skilled than the average players in matchmaking. Either way though, if you're struggling to win your fights in arena, definitely add in some extra creative practice and you might find yourself surviving much more often and gaining way more arena points. But with all that said guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video on how to stop losing arena points in chapter 3 season 4 and future seasons. Overall, if you follow all the tips in this video, you should find yourself getting back to gaining arena points and hopefully improving at the game at the same time. If you found this video helpful, then be sure to drop a like on it and consider subscribing as well if you want to see more content just like this in the future. And lastly guys, if you want to show some extra support, then consider using code TECHO in the item shop. It's 100% free for you and it seriously helps me out a bunch. As always, thank you so much to everyone who's using it. But with that said, thank you all for watching this video and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.